Okay, so I sent out an email, I think today, maybe yesterday, from Laura. We had talked in the past about the virtual meeting for the Cuba Partners Network that's going to be happening the 26th and 7th or 5th and 6th of September. And part of this is going to be free if you don't want to pay the $20 to register. So I sent out what Laura had sent me about how to register and attend that free streaming session on the Saturday. So I hope you all got that. And I used 2 different mail lists, so some of you probably got it twice. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll go ahead and get started. So the topic tonight is to talk about the history of the Presbyterian Church in Cuba. Getting ahead of myself, the name of the church in Cuba now is La Iglesia, the Church Presbiteriana-Reformada in Cuba, or the Reformed Presbyterian Church in Cuba. And we use the acronym IPRC for that. And again, getting a little bit ahead of myself, this is an image that was part of the recent celebration. The IPRC just recently celebrated the 130th anniversary of the presence of the Presbyterian Church in Cuba. And this photograph is a gentleman named Evaristo Collazo. I think I'm saying that correctly. He was actually the first. Is that correct, Lorenda?
I'm sorry, I missed that. What?
Collazo? The double L should be a Y sound.
Yes, yes.
So he was the very first Presbyterian pastor in Cuba. So I'm going to start out with, this is a little brief that was put together by the history department of the IPRC. And then I'm going to go back through this in a little bit more detail. On June 26th of 1890, so that's 130 years ago, a gentleman by the name of Reverend Anthony Graybill came to Cuba from Mexico at the request of Evaristo Collazo, because he had been doing Presbyterian services along with his wife in Havana, and was overwhelmed because he had a day job. So he requested of the Presbyterian Church that maybe they could send someone to help with guidance and advance the activities. So this Reverend Graybill came from Mexico. He was head of the PCUS, the Southern Presbyterian Church, their mission in Mexico. And when he came, he ordained Evaristo Collazo as a Presbyterian pastor, and he also ordained 2 people as elders and 2 people as deacons. Celebrated the first commission, and he actually ordained Collazo on his own authority, which raised some questions. But that is what it is. So the church began 130 years ago, but very shortly after that, the Spanish-American War, or as the Cubans call it, the Cuban War of Independence against Spain, interrupted the activity of the church. So it started and then it died off. There was this initial First Presbyterian Church in Havana, which Collazo was the pastor of. But the Spanish-American War interrupted this. But then the United States got involved and defeated Spain. Spain ceded control of Cuba to the United States. So United States was running the country for a while. And we talked about that some last week on the history of Cuba. Part of the time when Collazo was working in Havana, he also did some work in the Cuba city of, I lost my place here. I'll come back to that because it's been a long day. But Collazo actually, he went to Santa Clara. And I'm not quite sure why. I'll speculate on that in a minute. But he also originated church activities in the Santa Clara area. And then he got involved in this. He got involved in the Spanish-American War, the Cuban War of Independence. So he's the only pastor to serve in this revolution that took place. So let me go back and fill in some gaps here. To begin with, I want to point out some of the cities that I'm going to be talking about that were involved in this history of the church. So everything started in Havana. Also, Santa Clara was a major initial location after Havana. I'm going to be mentioning Matanzas, which is the location of the seminary, and also the church in San Jose de los Ramos. That's the partner church to University Presbyterian Church. So here's a synopsis, and then I'm going to come back and fill in the gaps. So, as I mentioned, in 1890, a small group of Presbyterians began to meet in Havana, and the leader of this, Collazo, asked the United States Presbyterian Church to send them a missionary. The first Presbyterian church in Havana was established that same year, and with Collazo as their first ordained Presbyterian pastor. And in fact, this first Presbyterian church in Havana was the very first Protestant church in the entirety of Cuba. They ended and then restarted later. So there's some question whether they are legitimately the oldest Presbyterian church or whether Juan G. Hall is. I'll come back to that later. So in 1985, the church in Havana had to close because of the Cuban War of Independence. But after the United States entered and defeated Spain, and Spain ceded control of Cuba to the United States, beginning in the year 1900, Protestant missionaries started arriving in Cuba, both in Havana and later in Cardenas, as I'll talk about in a minute. Among these Protestant missionaries were several Presbyterians who reinitiated the work of the Presbyterian Church. And this effort continued for another 60 years under the aegis, under the leadership, or as a part of the Synod of New Jersey, starting in 1904. So for 60 years, the Synod of New Jersey oversaw Presbyterian Church activities in Cuba. Fast forwarding a little bit, in 1946, a seminary was established in Matanzas. It's the Seminario Evangelical Theologia, or abbreviated SET. It was initially under Presbyterian and Methodist sponsorship, later joined by Episcopalians and Quakers, and then the Methodists pulled out. So this seminary is going, and this is under Spanish rule, now not Spanish, but Cuban rule at this point. The United States has stepped away from running the country. But the Cuban Revolution with Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and the others hit Cuba in 1959. And when that happened, within a year or two, the church had all of its schools expropriated. So the Cuban government, Fidel Castro, declared that all private schools in Cuba would become state-owned and operated schools, which was a major blow to the Presbyterian Church. And with the revolution, there was a reduction in the membership in the Presbyterian Church, as I'll get into.
Hey, George.
Not long afterwards.
Hey, George.
I'm sorry?
Wasn't there a very important school started by the people in Matanzas?
Yeah, not in Matanzas, in Cardenas, and I'm going to come to that later.
And that was started way back, huh? Back
Yeah.
in the 1890s, and it was like a big deal.
Yeah, it was a private Presbyterian college.
No, I thought it was like a high school.
The one that I'm aware of is something collegio. It was a college.
That means high school.
School's colegio. So it's a high
Yeah.
school.
So I'll come to that in a little bit.
Oh, okay. Because that seemed like it was a big deal when they expropriated the schools. That was a really big institution.
It was a major blow. And I've actually got some information here on how many students were involved there. Not long after the seminary is established, we had the revolution, and then the loss of all the schools. The churches were able to keep their property, but because the Cuban Revolution was expressly atheist to begin with, that led to a loss of membership. But partly in response to this, the Cuban church convened a series of meetings, votes, and so on, and they actually established an independent church, independent Presbyterian church, now separated from the Synod of New Jersey. And this was what became known as La Iglesia Presbiteriana-Reformada in Cuba, the IPRC. So the Presbyterian church in Cuba separated from the United States church, but maintained fraternal relationships.
Why did they do that? Do you know why?
I think they saw the writing on the wall that it was hard to be functionally working with the U.S. church, and they saw the need to essentially fend for themselves. But there was a very long process of different committees, votes back and forth. It was done in a very democratic process. And I'll talk in more detail about that also. Starting about 1990, the government became more open to Christian churches, and the Presbyterian church then began to grow again and continued to do so over quite some time. And the most recent event in the history of the church there is that in 2015 through 2019, a missionary team, which we don't call them missionaries anymore, but a team was assigned to Cuba. David Cortez Fuentes and Josie Sayas. David was on the faculty of the seminary, and Josie had her own work with different churches in the area. Unfortunately, both of them, along with Joella Holman, have taken advantage of a recent offer from the Presbyterian Mission Agency that anybody over, I think, 63 could take an early buyout retirement. So unfortunately, both David and Josie have decided to retire, as has Joella Holman. So let me go back, and I thought I had a slide here where I actually listed my source here, but I have a document that was written by Dean Lewis. Dean Lewis is sort of the senior emeritus member of the Cuba Partner Network. And he actually wrote a nice narrative of the history of the Presbyterian Church in Cuba. And I've drawn on that heavily. So I've cut and paste paragraphs from it that I think are relative. And I apologize for relying on that, but it's a very well-written document. And I've got a link to that where there's a web page where you can see the entire document if you like. So back to the beginning, starting in 1890. And this is officially the position that the Cuban Presbyterian Church takes, is that it began in 1890. I've read in some sources that there were Presbyterians present before that, but there was no organization. So in 1890, a Cuban layman named Evaristo Collazo began holding church services. He had been an Episcopal lay reader and then a Baptist lay preacher. So it's not quite certain why he chose Presbyterianism to affiliate with. But he had spent some time in the United States where he had sort of a birth of his faith. So it's not quite clear why Presbyterian, but he did. So with his wife, Magdalena, they opened a school in their home in Havana, and they taught Bible studies every day. They had a Sunday school on Sunday mornings and worship services with preaching on Sunday evenings. And their group grew to the point where Collazo didn't feel able to handle it all himself. So in March of 1890, he wrote to the Board of Foreign Missions of the Southern Presbyterian Church and asked for assistance and instruction on whether it would be appropriate for the U.S. Church to support the growth of Presbyterian Church in Cuba. He said, it's been a difficult struggle for me to keep this work going, since I have to work with my hands to support my mother and my wife. If possible, could someone come and see for themselves whether or not this enterprise merits oversight? So he started this in 1890, grew quickly enough that he felt overwhelmed, and so he called for assistance from the Southern U.S. Presbyterian Church. So the Southern Presbyterian Church in June of 1890 sent this Reverend Anthony Graybill, who had founded the PCUS mission in Mexico, sent him to Cuba to assist Collazo, noting in this assignment that the field shows a strong inclination towards the Presbyterian Church. So they saw this as a chance for the Presbyterian Church to gain a foothold in Cuba. While he was there, Graybill baptized 40 people, ordained 2 elders and 2 deacons, and they established this first Presbyterian church in Havana. Then, for reasons I don't understand, he then went, the 2 of them, Graybill and Collazos, went to Santa Clara by train. I think Santa Clara was one of the larger cities within Cuba. So this was a natural target for expansion. So they went by train to Santa Clara, and they spent 10 days holding evangelical meetings. And those were the first time that there had been Protestant services in that city of 30,000 people. When they returned to Havana, the First Presbyterian Church petitioned Graybill to ordain Collazo to the ministry, which he did. He took it upon himself. So he wrote, "Some of my colleagues think I took too much on myself to ordain him by my personal decision, but what else could I do?" He was already de facto the pastor and was going to remain so. So the First Presbyterian Church of Havana was established in 1890 with Collazo as the pastor, the first Presbyterian pastor in Cuba. So Collazo and his wife continued their evangelizing work in Havana and in interior Cuba in the Santa Clara area for about 5 years. And during this period, they had a periodic visitor from Mexico, a missionary named Juan G. Hall. During his first visit in 1891, Hall helped organize a church and a school in Santa Clara. And Collazo actually moved from Havana to become the pastor of that Santa Clara church in 1891. Hall returned in 1892, and the 2 of them together held church services in a variety of small communities around Santa Clara. So I don't know whether I pronounced these correctly, but Caibarian, Remedios, Camawani, and several other smaller communities near Santa Clara. Collazo's wife, Magdalena, had been working side by side with him, but she died in 1893. And some conflict developed within the Santa Clara church, plus revolutionary itching was growing in Cuba. But because the church in Santa Clara was not working well, the situation in Cuba was unstable. A recommendation was made, I don't know by whom, to the Presbyterian Church of the United States Mission Board in January of 1895 to suspend the work in Cuba. But before the board could meet, the Cuban War of Independence from Spain kicked off. It was an event or location called Grito de Barre. It was on February 24th, 1895. And that was the kickoff of the revolution led by Jose Marti, who was the strategist of this independence movement against Spain. As I mentioned a while ago, Collazo actually joined the army, and he served as a male nurse at the rank of lieutenant, and also a dentist, I understand. He was the only clergyman to serve in the revolution. So at that point, the Presbyterian Church in Cuba stopped. It came to an end while the revolution took place. Now, about that time, as the revolution is going, the United States intervened, and the Cuban War of Independence against Spain became our Spanish-American War. And the United States defeated Spain. Spain ceded control of Cuba to the United States. And it was no longer a Spanish colony. It was now a semi-independent United States colony. And I understand that there were those within the United States government that were arguing that it should become a permanent part of the United States, just as Puerto Rico did. But that initiative failed. But as the war had ended, the mission boards of 9 different U.S. Protestant churches started sending missionaries to Cuba. And in April of 1899, the PCUS board, mission board, sent Juan G. Hall, who was in Mexico and had been to Cuba several times already, sent him to Cuba, and he located in Cardenas. He was welcomed there by a woman who was a member of a New Orleans Presbyterian church. I'm not sure which one that is, Laura. I don't know if it was what's now St. Charles Avenue or what, but this woman, Isabel Waugh, was from a matriarch of the Torres Waugh family, this says. And Juan G. Hall asked for her help. Others followed Juan G. Hall. Janet Houston and Robert Wharton, who I'll mention later, arrived in 1899 at the end of the year, and 5 more people came by 1902. On February 11th, 1900, Juan G. Hall organized the First Presbyterian Church of Cardenas, which now bears his name. So that's the Juan G. Hall Church in Cardenas. It is argued that it is the longest serving Presbyterian church in Cuba. I think they make that claim because First Presbyterian in Havana shut down when the Spanish-American War happened. So that's probably bragging rights that are probably not agreed to by all Cuban Presbyterians. But being what it is, this church later was named for him. And it had 21 members, 2 elders, and 2 deacons. Not long after that, Hall died in 1904. So the gentleman I just mentioned, where was his name?
Walton.
Walton. Maybe I had it here. Robert Walton took up the mantle that Juan G. Hall had, and he continued to lead the Presbyterian development in that area then. So that was 1900. The next year, Wharton and Ezekiel Torres, who was I learned a new word, colporteur, which is a door-to-door seller of religious books. Actually, the definition says peddler. I didn't like that. But anyway, Wharton and Ezekiel Torres from the American Bible Society, and he was also an elder of the Cardenas Church, began preaching services in several other communities, Caibarian and Remedios, which had been previously involved with Hall and Collazo before the war. So they organized churches in both of these cities in 1902, and a school was opened in Caibarian in September of 06. Here's a good point for us. The same Robert Wharton also began work in 1904 in the small community of San Jose de los Ramos, and officially organized a church there in 1905. And this is our partner church for University Presbyterian. So San Jose de los Ramos Church, Gethsemane Presbyterian Church, has been in existence since 1905. So that's 95 plus 20, 115 years of age for our partner church. The other name I mentioned earlier, Janet Houston, working in Caibarian, visited the city of Placitas in 1906, initiated a house church there, and it became organized officially in June of 1909. So the growth of churches is slowly evolving from the Santa Clara area after having begun in Havana. The Presbytery of Havana was organized on November 16th of 1904 with 5 pastors, including Evaristo Collazo. It included 7 congregations with 416 members. Now, a little of U.S. history. There used to be a Northern Presbyterian Church and a Southern Presbyterian Church. The Southern Presbyterian Church is PCUS, both are gone. The Northern Church was UPC USA. And in 1982 or 83, the two came together to what we now call PCUSA, our existing US-wide Presbyterian Church. So the Presbyterian of Havana was established with Northern Presbyterian Church support. The Presbyterian of El Centro was organized in January 1st, 1914 in Placitas by the Southern Presbyterian Church. As I'll mention later, there are 3 presbyteries in Cuba. The third is the Presbyterian of Matanzas. Initially, that was a part of the Presbyterian of Havana until a later date, and I have not been able to locate a date on when that presbytery actually was started. And just as an aside, there's currently discussion going on in Cuba about establishing a new 4th presbytery in eastern Cuba that would break off from the current Presbytery of El Centro. One of the historical writers about the Cuban Presbyterian Church is Rafael Cepeda, and he made a point about the 2 different churches involved. He said that the Northern Presbyterian Church preferred to relate its work in Cuba to its Board of National Missions as if Cuba were a part of the territory of the United States, whereas the Southern Presbyterian Church assigned the work to the Board of Foreign Missions, so they saw this as a separate national religious organization. So we've gotten to the point where we've got several presbyteries formed. We've got Presbytery of Havana and Presbytery of El Centro. And the church in Cuba began to grow, both in its witness and its numbers, as this article said, over the next 4 decades, increasingly including in the leadership people born in Cuba rather than outside missionaries coming in to lead the effort. As a consequence of the growth, in 1946, as I mentioned, the seminary in Matanzas was formed by Presbyterians, also Cuban Methodist and Episcopal churches and Quakers. This seminary in Matanzas continues to be the only ecumenical seminary in Cuba. So not long after the seminary was formed, in 1959, Fidel's revolution succeeded and Batista was overturned and Fidel came into Havana. At that point, and there's some terminology here, the Presbytery of Cuba was the term used for the entire Presbyterian Church in that country. We now refer to it as the Synod of Cuba, with 3 presbyteries underneath it. Back then it was Presbytery of Cuba, and they reported that they had 4,200, 4,300 members in 34 congregations with 46 ministers. That's quite a number of growth in the number of ministers. And it's an important point to note here because this is more ministers, more Presbyterian ministers than there are in present day Cuba. They had almost 6,000 people attending Sunday schools in 1960, and there had been 231 infant baptisms that year. In addition, there were various Presbyterian schools in Sancti Spiritus, in Cabarrian, Cabaiguan, in Cruz Tejada and Guinness. So there were 1,400 students in those schools. And there was this college that had been established in Cardenas called Colegio La Progresiva. And that had nearly 2,000 students in it. On May 1st of 1961, not long after the revolution succeeded, Castro announced that all private schools would be nationalized. So all these schools that had been built up by such hard work in the Presbyterian congregations were taken over by the Cuban government. I mentioned the seminary. I'll just show you a few pictures of it. This is the Matanzas Seminary, the SET. It sits on the Bay of Matanzas, which you can see out front there. I showed you this picture before when I was talking about the geography of Cuba. And one of the nice things about the seminary, and here's more view of the Bay of Matanzas. They are on a hillside, and they have all kinds of crops being grown there. And they use these crops to feed the students and staff of the seminary, and they also sell them to people in the community. A lot of their crops were destroyed by the most recent hurricane, well, not the most recent, but the one that was about 4 years ago. But they have rebuilt this. And Karl Matzenbacher actually brought them some seeds to help reestablish their crops there. Here's another one of their buildings. This is back when we took the youth group in 2012. And here's the inside of their chapel. And I like it because the windows are purple and gold. So this is obviously an LSU themed church.
Yes.
But our youth group sang there, and it's a very pretty place. And here's just a quick summary. There's the website for the seminary. They actually offer quite a few graduate degrees, 4 different master's degrees, a PhD, 4 different bachelor's degrees, and then at least 4 other certificate or diploma programs for people who have not yet completed their 12 years of schooling that would lead them to be admissible for a bachelor's degree program. So there's quite an extensive training program at the seminary. Some of these people are resident students, and there's a resident staff there. And I think most, if not all, of the faculty live on the seminary site. But probably a majority of their students are commuters, they're non-residential. And just in the last week or so, the seminary opened classes for the fall. They spent a lot of time preparing to be able to cope with the coronavirus pandemic. But they have, I don't know how many of these programs have opened, but they have reopened classes there. So back to my historical story here.
George, question.
Yes.
Are all the students Cuban? Are there any international students there?
I can't answer that. My feeling is that I think there are some international students from other Spanish-speaking Caribbean countries. I know that there's a major Baptist church presence there, and actually there are 3 or 4 types of Baptists, as well as the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians. And in one of my visits, Linda Walker and I actually sat in on a class of English for seminary students to help them get enough English to be able to communicate. And English is the official language in the public schools of Cuba, so most Cubans have some exposure to English.
George, I don't know about today, but when I was there in 2000, they did have international students.
Good. Is that Barry?
Yeah.
I couldn't tell who spoke.
Yeah, that was Barry.
Okay, thank you. And I know there's also a seminary in the Dominican Republic where David Cortez has been teaching. So there are several of them in the Caribbean, and part of David's job was to actually coordinate among the various seminaries that involve Presbyterians through the Caribbean area. So we've had the revolution. Castro has nationalized all the schools that the Presbyterian Church had. And 2 years after Batista fell, the US government actually broke diplomatic relations with Cuba. And in that year, and I don't know the reason for this, it's part of the history where I've got a gap, but US airplanes actually bombed the Havana airports, killing a number of people working there. And of course, Castro responded, and he did so by proclaiming that Cuba was a socialist government. This had been kind of a murky issue when the revolution took place. It was not overtly socialist or communist. That came apparent later in 1961. So this was a problem because for Presbyterians and other evangelical Christians in Cuba, they had, in their education, had a vigorous opposition to communism. So this created a lot of anguish and confusion on what the churches were to do. The Presbyterians had just written and approved a 5-year plan to start in January of 1960, where one of the goals was to double the membership of the church. But this recognition that Cuba is now socialist / communist led to a lot of problems. So the church decided they were going to, I don't know if this was burying their head in the sands, but they decided they were just going to focus on trying to increase their membership. And they're also developing their camp. They have a camp that's called CANIP. It's kind of like our Feliciana. It's a national summer camp open to all Presbyterians and perhaps others. It's also a site where meetings are often held during the year. So the IPRC sometimes meets as a body at that location. And so this is some pictures I took when Linda Walker and I visited there in 2012. There was a significant damage done by a hurricane. They have since mostly rebuilt it, and it's a very nice facility. So this is a tough time. Cuba is now socialist or communist, and this led to a reduction in the membership. There were drainage from the membership of entire families who turned away from the church to become involved in the revolution, or they decided to exile themselves from Cuba. And soon the Cuban pastors began to reduce their numbers. And it's not sure how many people were lost, but Rafael Cepeda said that between 61 and 66, that the Presbyterian Church in Cuba probably lost half of its members and half of its pastors. So at the start of their 5-year plan, they had gained over 300 new members through the evangelistic activities of this plan. But from 61 through 84, there was a continuous loss of membership. Only a small group of people remained loyal to the church. By 1979, the membership had dropped to only 1,200 people, only 7 infant baptisms, and only 400 people attending Sunday school. So the Cuban Presbyterian Church decided they needed to pull themselves together and began the process of what became the independent IPRC. So it started in October of 1963. They set up what was called a National Presbyterian Institute. 170 lay people, 29 pastors, and more than 300 other people that had a discussion about the Cuban Presbyterian Church's future. And there were rounds of discussion, feedback, votes, and then meetings with the officials of the United States Board of National Missions, following which they set up what was called a special commission, which in turn appointed a special committee of 5 to study the details of all the proposals and discussions that had gone on, consult with higher judiciaries within the International Presbyterian Church, and prepare a plan to form the Presbyterian Church of Cuba. So this special committee of 5 reported its recommendations to the Presbytery of Cuba in January of 1966. It was then sent out to all the congregations in the country. They received suggested amendments back, and after incorporating those, the proposal was approved by the Presbytery in March of 1966. And that proposal was then forwarded to the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA. And Cepeda wrote, in spite of certain technical defects, and interestingly, the opposition of Cuban Presbyterians who had moved to the United States, the plan was approved by the Presbyterian Church of the United States with what he called a fraternal spirit and with historic vision. So in 1966, IPRC was approved. I guess 1967, because in January it actually was constituted in Havana, had a membership of 3,000 people, 146 elders, 30 churches, and now only 17 pastors. There were some commissioned church workers, 2 lay preachers, and 4 seminary students left in the seminary. During this process of forming the IPRC, some of the remaining pastors in Cuba left for the United States because they did not want to break their affiliation with the U.S. church where they had trained and had been ordained. So here's the makeup of IPRC. They now call the overriding body the Synod. And if you're not familiar with the terminology, this is the way we are set up in the United States in the PCUSA. Individual churches together cluster into a presbytery. Our presbytery is the Presbytery of South Louisiana. Then several presbyteries group together to become a synod, and we are the Synod of the Son. And then all the synods in the United States together form the General Assembly. In Cuba, they don't have that General Assembly level. They just have the Synod of Cuba. In 2018, the most recent numbers I had, there were 54 churches, but only 25 active pastors and 11 pastoral candidates in seminary. This has meant that pastors usually are responsible for multiple churches. In addition, the seminary students, pastoral candidates, get assigned to work in churches that don't have a full-time pastor. So Susana Arevalo, who was a water system operator in San Jose, as soon as she entered the seminary, she was assigned to be a pastor in training at Sabanilla, I think. And they moved them around. So she's now at the church in Versailles. The membership of the Presbyterian Church in Cuba now is estimated at about 15,000 people. So there has been a considerable resurgence in membership in recent years. And the Synod is broken into 3 presbyteries. There's Havana Presbytery in the west, Matanzas Presbytery, which is the central part of Cuba, and then there's El Centro to the east. Matanzas Presbytery, we have a partnership with them. Our Presbytery of South Louisiana has a partnership with Matanzas Presbytery. And as I mentioned, there's talk about starting a 4th presbytery, but we don't know when that might happen. And also the Matanzas Seminary, the SET, I've already mentioned this somewhat, founded in 1946. They are a strong presence in Matanzas, but Matanzas is in the middle of Cuba, and the largest city in Cuba is Havana. So the seminary is fundraising right now to try to build a branch campus in Havana. They're currently holding classes in Havana at some ecumenical location, but they don't have their own property. They don't have their own permanent staffing there. So they see the need to grow by establishing a branch campus there. So the Synod of Cuba, its moderator is Pastora Dora Esther Arce Valentin. She is pastor at the church in San Antonio de los Baños. And I need to point out, because this came to my mind immediately when I first heard it, baño does not just mean bathroom. It has a broader meaning of meeting room or area to congregate. Previous moderators of the Synod of Cuba that I've had the chance, and that's Dora's picture in the upper right-hand corner. And she was here in New Orleans for the Cuba Partners Network meeting last year. The moderator that preceded Dora is Ari Fernandez, who is one of the pastors of Matanzas Central. And before him, it was Daniel Izquierdo, who currently is pastor at the church in Luanyo, which is on the south side of Havana. The vice moderator for the Synod of Cuba is Pastora Ludmila Hernandez. She is the middle picture there. She is the pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Havana, which is the largest church in Cuba. And she is a remarkable lady. We first met her when we took the youth group to Cuba in 2012. She was a seminary student then. She is the first woman pastor of First Presbyterian. She is the youngest pastor of all the Presbyterian pastors in Cuba. And did I mention she's single? She was briefly engaged to one of the other pastors that we know. I won't name him, but that didn't work out. But Ludmilla has been written up in publications of the PC-USA. She's quite a remarkable woman. And I've got to the end of this presentation, I've got a whole bunch of Facebook postings, including the Facebook page for her church. So you can go to these different Facebook pages and see some of their activities.
George, I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you know when the Cuban Presbyterian Church first started ordaining women?
I don't know, but about half of them are women now.
Oh, I know that. That's obvious.
I
right?
don't know. That's an interesting question. I haven't heard.
Okay. I'm curious if it was about the same time as it was happening in our country, our denomination, or if it came later.
I don't know, but I think because the church was so small, well, logic doesn't always hold. You would think that if there were people with this
Right.
calling and the skills and the ability, that they would be ordained, but who knows?
Hmm.
The other leadership position I know of in the Senate of Cuba is the General Secretary, and this is Pastor Adalberto Valdez. We've met him when he came for one of the other Cuba Partner Network meetings. So this is and his church is in Cabarien, which is over near Santa Clara. So Ludmilla is in Havana. Dora is in San Antonio de los Baños, which is midway between Havana and San Jose. And then Adalberto is to the east near Santa Clara. So the leadership of the church is distributed. And there's a picture of Adalberto. So the next phase in our history is in October of 1985. Representatives of and at this point, the North and South Presbyterian churches had united to PC-USA. Representatives of the mission agencies of PC-USA visited the IPRC at the invitation of the Cuban church. And together, the two churches developed and adopted a mutual mission agreement that subsequently was approved by the General Assembly of the United States and the Senate of Cuba, the equivalent of the General Assembly. And as part of this mission agreement, it called for establishing partnership ties between the IPRC and a number of the governing bodies in PC-USA. And since that 1985 agreement, a number of presbytery to presbytery partnerships have developed. So there've been partnerships with presbyteries in Baltimore, Presbytery Cascades. I'm not sure where the Cascade Mountains are. I'm sure that's where that is. Chicago, Long Island, Monmouth, Puerto Rico, both are Synod and all three of their presbyteries. The Presbytery of St. Augustine, Florida, which includes the United Church of Jamaica, Santa Fe, South Louisiana, and West Jersey. Now, the three that are underlined there, which includes Transylvania, were the three presbyteries that first developed partnerships with presbyteries in Cuba. So the Presbytery of South Louisiana was in the first group of three. So more and more of these presbytery partnerships developed, and subsequently a large number of church-to-church partnerships developed, which eventually led in the United States to a organization of the Presbyterian Church called Cuba Partners Network, which is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. There were predecessor organizations, but the CPN is now 20 years old. So the history of University Presbyterian Church's partnership with our partner church in Iglesia Gethsemane, the Gethsemane Church in the small town of San Jose de los Ramos. Here's the background. In January of 1988, Presbytery of South Louisiana meeting minutes showed the approval of the first formal partnerships between PC-USA and the IPRC. So the Presbytery of South Louisiana had a partnership with Presbytery of Matanzas. The Presbytery of Long Island had a partnership with the Presbytery of Havana. and the Presbyterian of Transylvania, which crosses several states, formed a partnership with Presbyterian Centro. I set a timer, so I'm going to try and finish on time. Following those Presbyterian to Presbyterian partnerships, Nell Johnson in New Orleans, who played a major role in developing what became the Cuba Partners Network and growing partnerships between Cuban bodies in the two countries, she invited us at University Presbyterian to develop a church-to-church partnership. So the session minutes dated October 21st, 1990, showed that the session unanimously approved opening negotiations for a partnership with Gethsemane Presbyterian Church in San Jose de los Ramos. We agreed, and January 1991, the Presbytery of South Louisiana approved a 5-year memorandum of understanding between the two churches. So I claim 1990 as the year in which our partnership formed. That means we've been a partner with that church for 30 years, which I think is pretty cool. And as I mentioned, all of the PCUSA churches now that have partnerships with Cuban churches are organized under the Cuba Partners Network, which meets annually. And that meeting every 5th year is in Cuba. So we have 4 years in the United States and then the 5th year in Cuba. And that 5th year meeting was scheduled to be this November. It had to be canceled because of the pandemic. So it's being done virtually. And that's the meeting that I've talked about that you're invited to participate in if you like.
I have a question.
Yes.
Does the Cuba Partners Network, is that just Presbyterians? Because I know there's some non-Presbyterian churches that have.
There are churches from other denominations that are involved in the organization. It has opened up to allow that. So any Episcopalian or anything else that wants to be part of our group is invited and welcomed in.
The Northminster in Monroe, which is an Alliance of Baptist Church, has a similar relationship with the Cuban church as we do with ours. So I was just curious if they were involved with it.
I think if they paid their dues, they would probably be welcome.
Okay, all right.
Here's the makeup of the Presbyterian Matanzas. They've got 11 independent Presbyterian churches, and these are split into self-sustaining, which means they make enough money somehow to run their church, and 6 that require some external financial support, I assume from the Presbytery. So there are 11 churches, and then there are 11 more mission churches. There are 10, so that's 22 together. There are 10 active pastors in the Presbytery, 5 women and 5 men. There are also 5 retired pastors. So the leadership, the moderator of the Presbytery is Tanya Peterson. Vice moderator is Francisco Marrero. Secretary is Ari Fernandez, who you may recall I mentioned was moderator of the entire synod at one point. And Beatty Casas is the liaison between the Presbyterian Matanzas and all the different presbyteries that they have partnerships with, including us. So these are the pastors and their churches. So the first 2 here, Ari Fernandez and Beatty Casas, husband and wife, are co-pastors at Matanzas Central Church in Matanzas. Dopico, as he goes by, is the pastor at Dora Valentin Church in Veradero. We have stayed in their dorm there. Leticia Ramos is the pastor in Prince of Peace Church in La Playa, which is a suburb of Matanzas. Liz Elaine Capo is the pastor at the Good Pastor Church in Union de Reyes. Allison Fonte is the pastor at Wanji Hall Church in Cardenas. Yamilka Gonzalez is the pastor at El Puerto in Cardenas, and that's the church that St. Charles Avenue Presbyterian Church has a partnership with. Carlos Ham is the pastor at the Redeemer Church in Versailles, which is another suburb of Matanzas. And his wife is the moderator of she's Tanya Peterson. So her husband is Carlos Hahn, the pastor at El Redentor. Zorky Crespo is the pastor at Ricardo George Church in Perico. And Armando Guedes, who was the pastor at San Jose, is now at the Jerusalem Church in Yagüe Grande. And Francisco Marrero is a retired pastor. He's in Matanzas. So these are the Cuban pastors in the Presbytery Matanzas in 2008. I know every one of them except I don't know Yumilka Gonzalez. She is the pastor at the El Fuerte Church in Cardenas. So as I've said on more than one occasion, I know more Presbyterian ministers in Cuba than I do in the United States, which is kind of cool. This is a little bit different listing. It shows the different churches in the first column, the city that they're located in the second column, and then it lists each church's mission church. So for example, the church in Union de Reyes has a mission church in Sidra. Gethsemane, next to the last in San Jose, has a mission church in Manguito. The pastors are listed. The last column on the right shows the different churches that have partnerships with these Cuban churches. So that's just sort of a little bit of shuffling of the previous listing. One of the interesting things that came out of this is that all the Cuban churches use the same hymnal. It's a paperback book called Cantale a Dios. And in a 2005 trip to Cuba, Presbytery trip, Karen Foote was on that trip, and she was given a copy of both volumes of this hymnal. The one on the left is just the words. The one on the right is both the music and the words, what we would think of more as a hymnal, so that you could sight read the music. These books are not available in the United States. So I took it upon myself to digitize both of them. And I have them in PDF form, and I put them on thumb drives, and I gave them to all the pastors I knew in Cuba. And I sold them at a break-even cost to different churches in the United States. And if anybody wants the files, I'll give them to you for free. But for partners that have U.S. churches that have a Cuban partnership, access to the familiar hymns of the Cuban church is kind of important, because we have our own hymns that we're familiar with in our church. Probably every church is a little bit different. And when we go down there, we don't know the songs that are the core of their music tradition. So this was kind of a nice resource. So moving from the Presbytery level down to our partner church, the partner of University Presbyterian Church is Gethsemane Presbyterian Church in San Jose de los Ramos. And this is our partner church. They have a bell tower that they ring the bell to call people to worship. And this building that you see right here is the sanctuary building. It's also where our water treatment system is installed. And I'll show you that later. I'll move quickly. These are some old pictures of the original church going back 115 years ago or so. It was a wood clapboard church building. These are two different views. Here's a view on the left of the mission church in Manguito. I got these from Giselle Perez. She is a member of the San Jose church. When we first met her on our first trip, she was a gawky, shy young lady. She has since graduated from secondary school, and she is now at the University of Havana working on a degree program where she's studying the archaeology and history of Protestant churches in the United States. So she found these different images for me of the original San Jose church. There have been a variety of ministers at San Jose. People tend to rotate around. The first one that I know about was in 1990. That was Miguel Perez, followed by Mary Elise Diaz, and then Dopico. Now, Dopico is currently pastor at the Veradero Church, and he's also secretary of the Cuban Council of Churches. When he left, he was followed on an interim basis by Ofelia Ortega. She is an extremely well-known and highly revered pastor in the church. She is, I don't know, in her 80s. She just completed her PhD degree. She has held a leadership role. She has actually served in the Cuban government. So she's quite an interesting lady, but she is so down to earth. She was followed by Leticia Ramos, who served there for 5 years. Leticia is now the pastor at La Playa Church in Prince of Peace Church in Matanzas. And she's also secretary of the Presbyterian Matanzas. She was followed by Yubanis Herrera, and he was the pastor when Linda Walker and I scheduled to go to Cuba to prepare for the youth group trip in 2012. And just as we were getting ready to go, he left Cuba and moved permanently to the United States. So he's one of those, exile is not the right word, but one of the pastors that left the Cuban church to come to the United States for whatever reason. So he was replaced by Armando Guedes, and we actually met him before he'd actually been ordained. He left the San Jose church, moved to San Antonio de los Baños in Havana Presbytery, and then moved to Yagüe Grande Church, which is back in Matanzas Presbytery. So when Armando left, Leticia came back as interim. She was then replaced by Zorki Crespo, whose primary church is in a town called Perico, but she's also responsible for our church. So our church does not have a full-time ordained Presbyterian pastor. We do have someone there named Josue, who used to be an ordained Presbyterian church and left the church, preached for a while at the Baptist church, and felt a call to come back. So he is back working in the Presbyterian church. I don't know if it's serving penance, but he is essentially working and waiting for the Presbyterian to approve him to be a full pastor. And he has done an amazing job in the church there. This is the front of the sanctuary in the San Jose church. This picture doesn't have it, but they have a set of paraments that we made, that Pat made, and took down there. It's the red ones, which what calendar? Pentecost. The Pentecost banners and stoles. Marble floor, plaster walls. Along with the sanctuary building, there is an adjacent building where the pastor and his family live, and an intervening courtyard. And you can see to the left the cap on the well that provides their water. They are not connected to a city water supply. They have a well instead, and they have a pump for drawing water out into a tank up on the roof. In the last year, the well went nearly dry, so they had to stop treating water. Now, the area in the background where you see banana trees, other things, Pastor Armando Guedes decided to put in a swimming pool, which was scandalous because it was viewed as wasting funds that could have been put to better use. It was done without approval. So when he left, they filled the swimming pool back in with dirt. So it's still there, but it's now a vegetable garden. And in fact, this entire courtyard to the left is now used to raise crops. The area on the right has been cemented in, and before he left, Armando Guedes built this framework of rebar and planted in open areas. You can see there to the right of Michael, open areas where he planted vines, and the vines were to grow up these rebar trellises and develop a canopy so they would have a shaded area outside. And they actually have. This is what it looks like. I got this picture from Josue last week, where they're in the process of welding a solid steel bar tube to support the whole framework. So this is where they've dug up that backyard of the courtyard of the church. In the background, you can see some frutabamba trees, or what we would call
papaya.
What is it?
Papaya.
Papaya, thank you. They don't call it papaya down there because that has become an offensive slang term. So there are frutabamba trees back there. They've since planted peppers. That's Josue's wife there. They've also grown onions, yucca, and a variety of other crops for the church. In 2013, we installed living waters for the world treatment system at the church. And that window right there, I don't know if you saw the arrow move. Let me go back. first arrow right there points to the window that opens up for people to get water. And on the roof are tanks that hold untreated water and next to it treated water. And the water bottling station is where that last arrow is. I don't know if you can make that out or not. So people line up at this gate every day to get their water, and they fill the water at that water station. Here's another view of the water tanks on the roof. And this is the water treatment system in the little closet at the back of the sanctuary. There are at least 45 water installations in Cuba, and I'll talk more about living waters in a subsequent meeting of this group. But we installed this in April of 2013. Oh, and I have all these highlights of the different parts. There are 3 filters and so on. So you can see the people lined up to get their water filled, and they start out by spraying their water container with a bleach solution in front of that little boy. Because if you could put clean water in a dirty bottle, you've got dirty water. So they spray their water container with bleach, and then they rinse it with purified water, which is in that first little sink, and then dump that and then fill their containers with clean water. The woman in the window is Susana Arevalo. She was our initial operator for a number of years. She is now in the seminary. Something else we did down there is we installed a peace pole. We have one of these at University Presbyterian. It's outside the courtyard gate. And in multiple languages, it says, "May peace prevail on earth." So I think we did English, Spanish, Russian, and Chinese. And that's Armando Guedes. He was the pastor at the time. One last thing I want to touch base on is the Cuban Council of Churches, because that's another part of Presbyterian Church in Cuba, but it overlaps. The Cuban Church was an early member of this organization, Consejo de Iglesia de Cuba, the Cuban Council of Churches. It's located in Havana. It's a former home of a wealthy person. You can see to the right, that's Pastor DePico. To the left is Pastor Leticia, and in the background is Linda Walker. And they asked us if we would install a water treatment system there, so we did. They built this little room right here that has the tanks on it, and they also, to the right, built a room that could be used for meetings and worship services. And part of the team that did the installation included John Miller with his back to you and Michael Strain. So the sources that I used for this Cuba Partners Network history, that's the link to it if you want to read it. Also, there's a great initiative, and the principal investigator was somebody at a university in the United States, where they went to the seminary in Matanzas and digitized all of their records. So this webpage listed right here, you can, if you speak Spanish, if you don't, it might be a little bit harder, but you can go to their site and go back to all the records of the Presbyterian Church in Cuba that they have, committee meetings, all kinds of stuff. Also, a lot of these groups now have Facebook pages. There's one for the IPRC, one for the Luano Church, one for the First Presbyterian Church in Havana, San Antonio de los Baños, Matanzas Central Church, the Veradero Church, also the Presbyterian Matanzas. And there is a web page, not a Facebook page, but a web page for the seminary, and also a web page for the Cuban Council of Churches. So, I still ran over. Hard to not do. I apologize for that. But I take a little bit of solace in the fact that if you need to go, then you go. But we do have this recorded. Again, I will put a posting on the UPC Facebook page of where you'll be able to access it once I've got it posted. So, any questions, any comments? Just like my students, I put you all to sleep.
Miranda looks asleep.
Okay, so I believe next week, yeah. Welcome. I think, Carl, are you planning for next Wednesday for yours?
Yes. Yep.
Good. So next Wednesday will be about agriculture, and then the Wednesday after that, I'm tentatively planning to do the Living Waters for the World in Cuba, and we'll move on to science and medicine and what other topics seem reasonable.
Yeah, I just have one comment about the church in Cuba. I had a discussion with Del Pico, and they were saying that the government at one period of time, they were encouraging people to join the church because of, during the troubled times, people were having mental issues.
Yes.
There was despondency, and I don't know exactly what year that was. So if anybody knows that, it's a very curious time that they said people were committing suicide, and that the government actually was saying, you know, go to church, try to get more value in your life. And I don't know how that fit in with your timeline.
I know something I meant to include, there's always way more material than I can fit in, but at one point after the revolution, and with not the persecution of the church, but the benign neglect of the church and lack of opportunities for the church, a group of Christian pastors, 20 to 40 of them, I don't remember the number, met with Castro and essentially said, the government's policies are making life hard for people.
Mm-hmm.
And Castro said, well, that's not what we intended. So that began a little bit of the softening. And then one of the popes came and visited.
Right.
So those two together loosened it up, and it became more tolerable. And then there were successive lifting of regulations, so there could be paladars, the small restaurants, and people could be self-employed and so on. And that loosening improved once Raul Castro took over. And the new constitution was supposed to make things better. Turned out it didn't. They had hoped that it would include provision for accepting same-sex marriages, and that got excised at the last minute. They put in a limit on how many licenses anybody could have for a private business, which actually hurt entrepreneurial efforts. So it's a ebb and flow. Sometimes things get better and then they get worse. Right now, it's almost another special times. It's so bad in Cuba right now that they are loosening things up even more. And as I said last time, they're actually shifting more towards a dollar-based economic system, and they've removed the 10% tax on the conversion of dollars to CUCs. There was also a recent announcement that the Cubans only have about 2 months to turn their CUCs in and convert them to CUPs, the pesos. And we're not quite sure what that means. I've got probably $1,000 worth of CUCs that I bring with me when I go into Cuba to have startup money. But remittances, when they come from the United States into Cuba, are given to people as CUCs, and that's going to continue. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on with the currencies, but the dual currency system in Cuba, they've been threatening for at least 10 years to get rid of one of those currencies. But they're both so entrenched, it's going to be a difficult process. So we'll see how that plays out. Well, thank you all. Give me feedback if you want offline. If you think I should do something different, if you have topics you'd like to have covered. And if not before, I will see all of you hopefully next Wednesday. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, George.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.